And I'm going to call the meeting to order. And due to a defect in the warning, we're not going to hear the Groundworks application tonight, as you all know. I am going to ask for a motion to adopt the minutes of the meeting of April 21st. And I'm appointing both Gary and Dan as voting members. So can I have a motion, and then we'll just vote on that and then we'll move on. Nobody wants to make a motion to?
I'll make the motion to approve the minutes from the previous meeting.
Okay. Is there a second?
I second.
Okay, so it's Dan and Gary. And all in favor of approving the minutes of April 21st, please signify by raising your hand.
Aye.
Okay, it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to nothing. Oh, I should say, is there anybody opposed? Everybody raised their hand, so I'm not going to say that. All right, I'm going to introduce Sue Fillion, who's going to do some conflict of interest training for us. And if we're all going to mute ourselves during the training, if you have a question, everybody knows how to raise your hand, right, on the screen? And so we will do that if we have a question. Okay, Sue?
Yeah, Maya, the only thing I'd say is I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to be sharing my screen, so it might be difficult for me to see hands raised. So I actually don't mind. It's a small group if you just want to jump in.
Unmute ourselves and jump in?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Okay.
It's,
we'll do that then. But to start with, let's all mute ourselves and then let her get started. Okay.
Thanks. Let me get this up. And change the. Okay. Right. So thanks for coming out tonight. I think that this is important, and I want to thank Maya and Nora and Brian for really pushing for this training to happen. You know, a lot of you have come on to the Development Review Board, and maybe we sit down and talk with you and maybe give you some materials to look through, but we haven't really done a lot of face-to-face training. And it is important for your jobs, particularly as the Development Review Board. I mean, it's important for all the boards and committees, so I'd like to find a way to strengthen the training that we give to the boards and committees that the Planning Department services. And I think it's really particularly important for the Development Review Board because of the role that you play. And we're going to get into that in the first couple of slides. So I just wanted to start with a real kind of basic overview of the roles that are involved with land use at the local level. And so these roles are defined by both statute and by the function. And then there's three primary functions. There's the legislative role, the quasi-judicial role, and the administrative role. And there's different rules depending on what function is being fulfilled. And I'll get into that a little bit later, particularly when we talk about conflicts of interest and ex parte communication and that kind of thing. So the legislative function is the policymaking activity, and that's shared by both the Planning Commission and the Select Board. So this is where statute defines that the Planning Commission is responsible for writing and suggesting land use regulations, and the Select Board has the ultimate approval role. And so in the legislative role with land use, they're conducting public hearings, they're inviting public participation, and they're kind of laying out the direction for the community. The quasi-judicial function is where the Development Review Board sits. So basically, after the policy is determined in the plan, or as it relates to the Development Review Board in the land use regulations, the bylaws, the DRB is responsible for interpreting and applying the regulations to the specific applications. And as you know, your role is kind of like an independent court. And so we're going to get into that a little bit. And then the administrative function is currently held by the zoning administrator, Brian. So he applies the bylaws to applications. He has the ability to issue them. He assists applicants, and he's also responsible for enforcement. Back to the DRB. The type of applications that you see are site plan review, subdivision review, conditional use review, appeals of the zoning administrator's decisions, and variances, which you don't really see too often in Vermont. But these are the kind of reviews that come before you. I'm sure there's a couple of others. I'm thinking waivers that aren't in this list, but this is kind of the basics. And a couple of things to keep in mind when you're sitting on the DRB is that you should only be approving applications that comply with the applicable bylaws. And you should only be putting conditions on them that are authorized under the land use regulations. And if the project meets all of the applicable criteria, then you must grant approval. The opinions of individual members should not affect the decision-making of the board. Again, it's applying the rules to the application before you, leaving out opinions, and we're going to talk about that with bias in a little bit. And you should avoid conflicts of interest and refrain from discussing applications outside of a hearing. That's ex parte communication. So we're going to cover both of these, both conflicts of interest and ex parte communication as well. And you know, when you're acting in this quasi-judicial role, you have, you know, there's a couple of things that you need to keep at the forefront, and that is that all the parties have rights that you should be considering. All parties can present evidence. All parties can cross-examine witnesses and question evidence. That there needs to be a written decision, and that decision is appealable. So again, you're acting in a court-like function or role. And when you're acting in that role, parties have constitutional we have to have due process for the parties involved, and they have that right under the US Constitution. It's in the 14th Amendment. So it's just important to keep in mind that there's due process that needs to be followed. And the essence of due process is that the hearings need to be warned, that people have to have an opportunity to be heard. The meeting should maintain order. We need to manage evidence during the meeting or the hearing, I should say, and members need to avoid conflicts of interest. So conflicts of interest, I think I have the definition on the last slide. I probably should have put that first, but basically they're not acceptable. They're going to damage the public trust that the board would, that the public might have in the development review process. If we're not handling conflicts of interest correctly, it's going to make decisions seem discretionary. So we want to have an objective process. We want to make sure we remove conflicts of interest. Again, there's a constitutional right to have a fair process, and conflicts of interest don't provide a constitutional right to a fair process. And it's also important to remember that if there's a conflict of interest, and that the court can actually remand or vacate a decision made by an official that has, or a DRB member that has a conflict of interest. And there actually was a court case in reappeal of Gardner Stone, where I'm going to use the term ZBA, Zoning Board of Adjustment, that's comparable to the Development Review Board. It's just kind of a different model of handling land use boards in towns. But this case involved a husband of a Zoning Board of Adjustment member who participated in a hearing as an interested person. The wife was on the Zoning Board of Adjustment, and she did not recuse herself, and she had the ability to influence other people making decisions for the deliberations. The decision was appealed, and the environmental court remanded it back for a new hearing. And they said it offended the basic principles of having a fair hearing. So again, that gets to the public trust, but also the constitutional due process. So, so conflicts of interest, can, if you have one and you're sitting on a hearing, it can, result in court action. So this is the definition of a conflict of interest from the Development Review Board's Rules of Procedure. So it's any one of the following: a direct or indirect personal interest of a board member, his or her spouse, household member, child, stepchild, parent, grandparent, grandchildren, sibling, aunt or uncle, brother or sister-in-law, so family, a business associate, employer or employee, in the outcomes of a cause, proceeding, application, or any other matter pending before the board. In the next slides, we're going to get into what is a direct or indirect personal interest. A situation where a board member has publicly displayed a prejudgment of the merits of a particular proceeding before the board. So this is bias. This shall not apply to a member's particular political views or the general opinion of a given issue. And 3, a situation where a board member has not disclosed ex parte communications with a party in the proceeding before the board. I realized that I deleted one because I thought the 1 and 2 that I had on there were the same, but one is a personal interest and one is a financial interest. So if you look at the first one there, think of it repeated, but instead of a personal interest, it's a financial interest. I couldn't figure out the difference between the two, and now I see it. So I apologize for that. So let's get in depth a little bit about the categories of conflicts of interest. So the first set is the financial interests. So the direct is where a local official acts on a matter affording the official a direct financial gain. And in this case, replace official with DRB, a member of the Development Review Board. These direct financial interests are generally the easiest to identify. And in fact, the Vermont Supreme Court has ruled that town officials cannot make a profit from their office because they actually act in a fiduciary role for all the townspeople. So an example of this type of conflict of interest would be like a Development Review Board member acting as a project manager to an application that is before the DRB. Are there any questions there? And I should say, I'm not an attorney, so if we have specific examples or questions, I might need to get back to you on some of those, on any questions that you might have. But again, it's kind of a direct financial interest that's going on here. And the indirect is the same, but the local official is acting on a matter that financially benefits a person or group closely tied to the official. So, maybe in this situation, take out the DRB member is the project manager and replace it with the DRB member's child or brother-in-law or something like that. That could be a conflict of interest. One of the examples that Vermont League of Cities and Towns gave was if you're thinking about the select board would open bids at a meeting and maybe a family member owns a company that submitted a bid. If that family member got the bid, then there would be the appearance, could be appearance of a conflict of interest.
Sue,
Yeah.
if you work for an organization that is submitting the application, let's say, or then that would also be a conflict, right? That's an indirect. I mean, you don't actually have to be managing the project.
I would agree, whether it's a financial or a personal conflict, we'll get into the personal ones next. I think it has the appearance of a conflict of interest, and we'll get to what to do if you think you're in that situation. But yeah, I mean, I'm always going to advise to err on the side of caution. So if you are working for a company that's submitting something, it's probably, at least you should be disclosing it.
And in a voluntary capacity as well too, right? So if you're both doing volunteer work for that particular
Yep.
entity.
We're gonna get to that in the personal, but yes. Yeah. So the second set is the personal influences. So the direct is when a local official acts on a matter that benefits the official in a non-financial way, but in a matter of significant importance to the official. And I was trying to kind of think about, a situation like this. The example that the Vermont League of Cities and Town gave is that the select board is considering opening up a town road to snowmobiles, and one member lives on it. So, they might have an interest because they really love snowmobiling, or they might have an interest because they don't want that noise. So I guess in this situation, you could think about a development review board member that maybe lives off a right of way, and somebody's coming in and proposing, 3 new housing lots that would be using that right of way. There could be a conflict of interest there for that member. These can be difficult to identify. So again, we're going to get to how to deal with conflicts of interest. And I think disclosing is always kind of a first step. And then the indirect is kind of, Gary, what you were talking about. Maybe you volunteer for an organization. So this is when you're acting on a matter that, there's some other relationship. It could be a family or a personal relationship. It could be membership to an organization, and a desire to help that person or organization further its own interests. So a good way to think about this is a conflict of duties. Are you acting on behalf of the town, or are you acting on behalf of that organization because you want to see whatever it is? And so, yeah, the key here is, if you decide a matter in which you maybe have an indirect personal conflict of interest with, then it could result in the perception that you're furthering someone else's interests over the town. So I think an example that I came up with here, well, the one that VLCT gave was a member sits on an appeal. So if you're on the select board, you're automatically a member of the Board of Civil Authority. And so then if they were sitting on an appeal of a family member, so, translating that to the DRB, it could be you have a family member that is appealing a zoning administrator decision, and you sit on it. Another example that I could think of was maybe you're on the board of a nonprofit or of your church, and they're proposing some sort of addition, and it's before the DRB for site plan review. That could be a conflict of interest.
So that'll be like, i.e., I say I volunteer at FoodWorks just for one day, or for Groundworks for one day. That doesn't make you a permanent volunteer. Does that make sense? Versus being, I mean, how would that be defined, I guess?
There is no, there's not a certain level that puts you that puts you over a threshold. I think that makes it a conflict of interest, but I think maybe the next slide will help. Conflicts of interest other than the direct financial I think the financial ones are more clear. I think the personal ones are a little less. So the recommendation is disclose it. So when you're at the meeting, you could say, okay, FoodWorks is up for an addition, just so you know, I volunteer there 1 day a week. It can be discussed amongst the board members. And maybe you walk away and say, I'm there 1 day a week. You know, I feel like I can adjudicate this fairly. Or you just recuse because you just don't even want the appearance of the conflict of interest. You know, one of the things about the Development Review Board is that we do have alternates, and it's for this reason. Brattleboro is not a huge town, and inevitably, you know, there's people who might have some sort of relationship to something that's going on. So, but discussing it, you know, you can either discuss it with Brian or myself in advance, or bringing it to the entire Development Review Board. I think disclosing is just really important. And obviously recusing is always a good thing too. And recording, I think that's a great suggestion as well, to make sure that it's reflected in the minutes, particularly because if it's appealed, it's clear for the record.
Yeah, being that we're a town of volunteers, and pretty much people volunteer almost everywhere, from the co-op to wherever, you know, that's the variance there, that you disclosing that information. But even a donation, would that be considered? If you donate to that particular work, does that consider the conflict?
I can't really answer that question. I don't feel comfortable. What I would say is, you know, when you're acting in this, when you're on the Development Review Board, because you have that quasi-judicial function, you know, I think the conflict is even more sensitive. You know, the conflicts of interest for a select board member acting in their legislative role is different, but because you're in kind of this court hearing like setting where there's constitutional due process, I tend to think a donation to an organization would not represent a conflict of interest. That's my gut, but again, I'm not an attorney. You know, lots of people will make donations, and you know, state statute does say that a conflict of interest is not something that benefits, or it, how do I want to word this? In certain situations, if I guess the example I would give is that the Planning Commission in their policy setting role is often making determinations on, you know, multifamily housing or the zoning districts or something like that, and it applies evenly across the board. And so they might have an opinion on it. I guess I'm getting into bias a little bit. You know, I'm happy to kind of take up your question about a donation to the town attorney. I think, you know, if you're making...
one of the things the board has done in the past, recognizing, you know, how complex it can be, is people disclose if they feel that they don't have it, they won't be biased and can hear something fairly, they'll state that, and then they'll also request of all interested parties if there's anybody who has concerns or contests that. And if any of the interested parties do in fact have concerns about bias, then that person steps aside to eliminate that appearance.
Yeah, I would have to agree, Brian, because if you're a donator to an organization or a church, that would put you in that category. Not saying a sense as a member, but as it would be a conflict because you know the workings and the doings of that particular organization, and that might tilt the scale a bit. Does that make any sense?
I would think it would depend upon, I mean, so I give $50 a year, let's say, to Groundworks. I don't know anything about
You're
their
muted, Maya.
organizational structure, or I'm not intimately familiar with that. So my intention when we hear Groundworks is just to disclose that I'm a donor.
Yeah.
And let them decide whether they think I have a conflict. I mean, I don't think I do.
Yeah.
What I know about Groundworks is what I've gotten from reading the paper, which everybody does, and from looking at the documents they've submitted to the DRB. You know,
Yeah, I mean, I
so
think
I'm not
there's
sure there's anybody on the board who hasn't donated.
yeah, I think there's, you know, a big difference between contributing to an annual appeal or contributing, you know, or the opposite, maybe you're contributing to a building campaign and you're going to have a name, you know, a room named after you. I think, you know, there's a lot of gray area and conflicts of interest, but to me, there's like a stark difference. I think, you know, a major donation and you're going to have something named, you know, for a specific building campaign, I would say, you know, I think your strategy of disclosing even at a, you know, a donation to an annual appeal or something, I think is good practice. And I like what Brian had to say, how the board has operated in the past. I think that just puts it out on the table and then, you know, takes care of, you know, the potential for an appeal on a matter of a conflict of interest if it's found out later. So again, you know, be sure that you understand the rules of procedure and follow them. Recuse when necessary. Use the development review board alternatives. And just remember that, you know, we want to maintain public confidence in the development review, public confidence in development review board. So getting back to due process, in addition to conflict of interest, bias is an important consideration for procedural fairness. And this is particularly important in the quasi-judicial hearings. So, you know, it can be different before the Planning Commission and the Select Board. So I just want to be clear, it's different in the legislative setting than it is in the quasi-judicial. So bias is a situation where a public official has publicly displayed prejudgment of the merits of a particular proceeding, and this shall not apply to a member's particular political views or general opinion on a given issue. So bias is a predisposition towards judgment prior to hearing all the evidence in a case. And so we know that everybody comes to the table with certain biases. It could be towards people, it could be towards a project, but you can't allow it to prejudge the application that you're going to hear. One of the things that VLCT said that I really liked and that resonated with me is you need to be disinterested in the results of the case. So this gets back to, you know, hearing the evidence and applying it, and, you know, to the standards. So again, you need to be disinterested in the results of the case. A good quasi-judicial decision is a fair and impartial application of the rules at play to the facts presented without regards to your personal beliefs or opinions. And this is, again, just fundamental to due process. An example that there was a court case in St. Albans that Vermont League of Cities and Towns talked about. And basically it was a situation where a development review board member was wearing a St. Albans needs a Walmart hat at a hearing in which the developer was before the development review board for a new Walmart in town. And the application was approved, the Walmart was approved, and it was appealed by interested persons. And basically they said that their due process rights had been violated. And the judge ruled that the hat, I should say the DRB member that was wearing the hat also filed an appeal and said it was his right to be able to wear whatever he wanted to wear. And the judge essentially ruled that the hat and the development review board member wearing it destroyed the appearance of fairness that due process requires. And so she wasn't saying that you know, he used bias in his decision making, but even the appearance of being on one side, you know, is not fair and impartial. So it's not just about having the hearing be fair and impartial; it has to appear that way too. So I think, but I think there's some good tips in here about not being interested in the outcome and, applying the rules to the facts presented, regardless of your beliefs or opinions. And then finally, the other procedural fairness issue is the ex parte communications. And so, oops, sorry. This means a direct or indirect communication between a member of a public body, the Development Review Board, and any party, party's representative, party's counsel, or any person interested in the outcome of a quasi-judicial proceeding that occurs outside the proceeding and concerns the substance or merits of the proceeding. And again, this is a problem in the quasi-judicial hearing setting because due process requires an impartial decision maker. It's legally appropriate in an executive or a legislative context. So, the Planning Commission is working on some policy changes, recommendations. They're going to have conversations with people. They want to get the pulse of the community. Same with the select board. They might have somebody that calls them up to talk about something that's going to be on the agenda. So again, it's very different in the legislative session situations than it is in the quasi-judicial DRB setting. So again, part of the constitutional right to a fair hearing is everybody knowing all the evidence that the board will rely on to make a decision. And that's not possible if parties have access to the Development Review Board members outside of the hearing. It can allow one person to influence a decision maker without rebuttal from the other parties. And it also undermines the transparency in decision making. So ex parte communication can create a conflict of interest. And you should not be having conversations with people, once an agenda is set, or even before that, if you knew something was in the works and you're having some sort of conversation, you should kind of stop it and say, oh, that might be coming before the DRB. I can't have this conversation with you. And the way that ex parte communication might take place is, you could simply be standing in line at the grocery store or getting a cup of coffee, and all of a sudden you're in a conversation about the Amtrak station or some other project that's before the Development Review Board, or maybe it's coming your way. So you should not be talking about the projects with anybody. If you've received an email from anybody or had a conversation, you should introduce it at the hearing and get it into the record. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean recusal, but if you stopped it, if you can say, well, I was in line at the grocery store and, somebody said this, and this about this project and, asked if I could do this. You could say, that conversation happened. I told the person I couldn't, speak with them about that. So again, disclose is an important part of it.
Sue,
Yes.
isn't, when I was first on the board, I had a neighbor who was asking for a change of use. And I took a walk down the street just to walk by the place to see what it looked like. And some other neighbors came out and asked me what was going on. And I really didn't know any better. And so I said, well, she wants to start a yoga studio at her house. And if you want to know more, you can call Brian. And I think they did. I gave them the number, but I recused myself from the hearing because I had talked to interested parties. I don't think they actually showed up at the hearing, but they expressed an opinion to Brian. And they weren't objecting to what she wanted to do. That wasn't the issue, but they had still talked to me about it. So I think that's that's an example. I mean, I talked to James Valente was the chair
Mhm.
at the time. And I talked to him before the meeting and he said, just disclose it. And, you know, he recommended that I probably should recuse myself. So I did.
Yeah, and I think, that's the conservative, and that's perfectly appropriate. It kind of goes to what Vermont League of Cities and Towns says, which is, err on the side of caution. I wouldn't, anybody that feels that they want to recuse themselves, I think that that's totally fine.
So when he says conversations like that, refrain for that, let's let them know that it'll be at the next meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're approached with questions, just say, it's at the meeting and direct them to staff if they have any questions. Yeah, or, you could say you can send comments in to Brian or come to the meeting. Inevitably people, are going to know that some of you sit on the development review board. So, the conversations usually happen very informally. Another part about ex parte communication too, it's, when you're on a site visit, I know that you've done some, I don't know how much has been done over the last year, well, probably not very much because of COVID, but when you're in those situations, you're there to observe. You shouldn't strike up a conversation with the property owner who's trying to do something, because then that one-on-one conversation could influence you. So that could be a form of ex parte communication, or it is a form of ex parte communication. That's why I kind of specific when you do site visits that you're there to observe, and then you're going to enter your observations into the record at the hearing. Because not everybody's going to be able to, the entire public or interested people are not going to be able to attend to the site visit always. So conduct the business in the hearing. Dan.
Yeah, just to be clear about what recusal means, is that simply not attending the meeting where the issue is being heard, or you do attend and you don't vote?
Yeah, so recusal, I think the way, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe Maya, as well, when you recuse, you actually leave the hearing. But sorry, I should say just the particular item that's under discussion. You can come back for, if there's a couple of hearings that night, you can join in on the next one.
Yeah, so when the board met physically, it was a matter of leaving the room. Some people did have an interest in a particular application where they actually had to testify for or against it. So, the relationship with the rest of the board has to be, you have to be conscious of that and not allow it to influence your decision.
So if I had a question about a particular site that I walked by and seen, I would have to bring it up at the meeting or just give Brian a call?
You as a development review board member, you should call Brian. Yeah, you as a member, you shouldn't walk by the site and then pop your head in and say, hey,
What's going on?
what's going on? What's your plans? You shouldn't do that.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. So this contact, ask Brian the whatever is going on at that particular area or construction that's popping up. Okay, perfect.
Yeah. I'm going to put this down so that I can see all of you, but I don't know if you have some other questions or scenarios that you want to run by.
Can we get a copy? I don't know if you have copies of that for me just to look over personally
Yeah.
for myself, but I can always, any questions I can have, I could just email you or Brian.
Yeah, I can share that, and we can share the questions with everybody.
In like Google Docs, I
On
guess.
the
Or...
DRB. Well, we
Okay.
have to be careful of open meeting. We could put together an FAQ, we
Oh,
could send it out
perfect.
to everybody. Yeah. Anything?
I see a lot of sleepy people. They need coffee.
Thank you, Sue.
You're
I think-
welcome.
I think this was very helpful, and I'm sorry that everybody wasn't able to join us. But you recorded it, right? So
It
that,
is recorded.
so
Yep.
that they will be able to watch it.
Yep, and BCTV is here, so we can definitely share it, and we can reach out to the members that aren't here. So I think it's important for everybody.
So I thank you. Thanks, Sue. It's really helpful. I'd just like to say on the site visits I've been on, it's pretty common for neighbors and other people to come out and ask what we're doing.
Yeah, and I think, you should probably leave it at, we're here on a site visit. This is going to be heard at a hearing, on this, on this night, or, at 7 o'clock tonight.
Yeah.
If I could just ask a kind of a question that's really relevant to me, this is what made me hesitant about possibly being a member of the Planning Commission as well as the DRB, as far as the potential for conflict of interest. And I just wonder how many experiences there have already been, and what kind of guidance you can give to anyone who's on both. As far as, if there were examples already,
Wasn't James on both for a while? James Valente?
Yep, James was on both.
There was somebody else that I can't remember.
James may have been the last one. Frank, can you remember somebody else?
Before James, before I
Uh,
even moved here.
Yeah, I'm not recalling. There have been some people who moved back and forth from one board to the other, like Joe Bushy.
Yeah, That's
But
who I-
not simultaneous. Yep.
I do want to, I should have mentioned at the start. So these slides were based on a training that I did with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns in April. So they were based on that, as well as some other land use guidance that Vermont has put out over the years. And I'm just quickly looking, Dan, the FAQ for the VLCT session that I attended did address the being on the DRB and the Planning Commission. So I'm just trying to get that really quickly.
while you're looking for that, I guess I'm wondering, in some situations, if there is any gray area, that where you would perhaps consult the other board members to say that you're willing to admit there might be a conflict of interest, for example, but the other board members might not think there is one. Maybe a conversation could ensue, but that might be very ponderous. I don't know if that's really necessary. It might be better to just recuse yourself and be done with it.
I think the way I've seen it done with other boards is somebody will say, I'll use the donation. I just want to declare that I have been an annual donor to this organization. But I don't believe that that is a conflict of interest, because I'm trying to think. I think you could see.
Yeah, if you don't have a vested interest in the outcome, essentially, the way I see that donation issue, you're doing it the best. I mean, as far as benefiting the organization, the other benefit to you is you're giving a tax deductible donation. That's about it, as far as I can tell. But I get it as far as associating yourself with an organization, but that doesn't seem like a conflict of interest to me. Unless you were donating like $1 million or something, and then
Right.
you have a vested interest in the continuation of the organization or whatever.
Yeah, but you could declare it and you could say, I don't think I have a conflict, and, board, what do the rest of you think? And maybe you all say, yeah, no, we don't see a conflict. And then you turn to the applicant and you say, do you view that? Do you have any concerns about that?
Yep.
Then
Yeah, I
sense.
think if you're not like a member with an organization and
Yeah.
making that tax donation, if you're just donating, it's a gray area because you could be just sending money to an organization, another organization can give you information about it. So, like you said, that disclosure helps navigate to which direction it needs to go, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very gray. I mean, you could be a parishioner at a church and, maybe you declare that, but say, I don't really have a vested interest in the outcome. Again, the safest thing is to recuse, but, again, I
There
think
was this situation, Sue, and I don't know if this helps Dan, but when the Brattleboro Music Center came to the board about their new building, and we were disclosing potential conflicts, and my husband was very active in a couple of the musical groups there, and James disclosed that his daughter took violin lessons there, and a couple other board members had relationships like that with the BMC. And we all disclosed them. We asked the head of the music center whether she felt uncomfortable, and she said no. So none of us recused ourselves. Do you remember that, Brian?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things, being that it's a small board and a small community, there will be occasions where many board members have some relationship, and it is necessary to have a full board to be able to hear applications. So disclosure really is key, and it could even be something where somebody expresses no concern at the beginning, but later on in the meeting, they might say, well, given your comments, I think there's bias there, and then ask you to step aside. But it has to be open so people at least have that opportunity and can accept that you're acting in an unbiased way.
So when does that disclosure, do you mention the disclosure
At the
prior
beginning
before?
of the meeting, I
Okay.
always ask, does anybody have any conflicts of interest or has had ex parte communications?
Okay.
And
Perfect.
that's when you speak up.
So Dan, I'm not putting my hands on it quickly. I will send that out, but I have seen interpretations that, from VLCT that sitting on both boards is appropriate, but yeah, I can understand how it could be a little bit different or tough to navigate.
Maya, have you ever gotten to a situation where you had to call in Bob Fisher? I'm just curious to ask a particular item, or if it was a conflict of interest. Never?
No, because we tend to err on the side of caution.
But certainly if any of you have any questions, because you see an agenda, you can always reach out to us, and
Yeah.
We can help walk through that and access the town attorney for that.
That's one of the reasons why we send out the agenda so early.
That, and it needs to be warned
Yeah,
in advance so that people have, due process.
Yeah.
Have advanced warning. So I know that there's some other training that we're hoping to be able to get to you members, particularly relating to subdivisions. I've been trying to arrange that with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, but they're pretty swamped with everybody being remote. I think that the end of June, there's going to be a couple of planning and zoning type webinars or conferences. So we'll be sharing that information, but there might be some trainings that you're interested in for that. And those, I haven't seen it yet, but that's what VLCT keeps telling me. But we really appreciate your service and want to help you be as prepared as you can be for your roles.
Yeah, hopefully by June 1st, once Peter makes the announcement of whether we're opening certain things or not, at the select board meeting last night, I think we'll know if we're going to be still remote or in person.
Dan.
I just had a thought about the ex parte communication, and I was just wondering if there's any extended guidance about the idea that you might feel like you are under duress in some way if the person who's communicating with you is in some way in some sort of power position. And I don't mean that someone's going to bribe you or anything like that, but just the subtleties of perhaps it's someone who's really abusing their power. And I just had a thought that, it's not just sitting in, or, you're in the grocery store or something like that, but it could be someone emailing you.
Mhm.
It could be someone, actively seeking out your favor. And that I understand there's a, basic response, hey, I can't talk about that, but actually that person is kind of overstepping a line intentionally. And I'm just wondering if we have any responsibility to say that we have been approached in some way. Just it's like we're trying to be as honest as we can, of course, but what if we know that someone is seeking influence?
It's a good question. I'm sorry, Maya, just real quick. One, I probably want to run by the town attorney.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm just wondering if, I would come forward with the information, but I mean, then you're starting to get into, this person is actively seeking influence. Maybe they've sought it with other people. It can become messy, I'm sure.
You should tell Sue or Brian right away.
Sure. Yeah, like a one-on-one type. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, not bring it to the whole board. Yeah.
I think you should, because then we can also put out a
Yeah.
to the rest of
Yeah, I can imagine it could happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I may say, the only other conflict of interest stories I've heard have been with the housing and urban development programs, and anything with development involved. There's obviously there's a lot of money involved, and there are some real crazy stories of these developers and whatnot, all kinds of interested parties seeking out influence.
That's
Yeah.
what I did for 10 years before I retired. I was the HUD compliance officer for the city of Boston, and that's one of the things that
Yeah.
I have to deal with.
I bet. Yeah.
There's a great podcast, and I listened to it a couple of years ago. I can't remember the name of it, but it was a whole series on Buddy Cienci in Providence and his fall from grace. And then it went to Detroit. So it was basically looking at, public, buying influence and the downfall of these mayors. And it was really fascinating. I found it really interesting. I was waiting for the next city they were going to take on, but there's not been another one that's come out.
Well, being from New York, there's a lot of times, and I understand what Maya's saying, sometimes envelopes, I'm gonna leave this envelope on your desk. So I know about, I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the doings of townships and cities. So if something like that does occur with a large project, what is the normal recourse? Besides letting you know what happens then after that particular interaction, it gets back to you, Sue, or to Maya or Brian, what normally happens then? Would I have to not be in that meeting? Okay, I have to rescind because of the interaction with that person and letting you know, because that could be a conflict, because now I know what this person's intentions are. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I think that it's the disclosure, it's the, erring on the side of caution. If you've been able to stop the conversation in its track, and, maybe we don't have alternates that can sit, probably want to talk to the town attorney about that. But again, it's the disclosure and who's comfortable,
Yeah, because I didn't know what would happen with the person that was bidding or putting in the bid, and then they say, well, this person approached me with this to waive or sway my decision with some type of, I don't know, bribery or whatever. And I say, well, this is what happened. Has it ever happened in the history of DRB since you've been on? Or I know it works in the city, so I'm just
yeah,
saying.
no, I mean, I think that I don't know if it's happened. I think in my time with the town, I'm not aware of it happening. I think that we're fortunate. The DRB has a good, solid reputation. I don't, it's been like that for a long time. So I don't think there's anybody trying to curry favor.
Good honor system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if anybody did do that, you definitely want to call it to our attention, because the town would want to proceed further with that and take it seriously. I think it's a lot more common that where people feel gratitude for decent consideration and appreciate the professional work of the board, and might say something like, oh, I'd love to get you a coffee now, or some other type of gratuity. And that there's nothing nefarious in that, but of course you refuse politely and back away from it. But yeah, that's the worst thing I've seen here, is people being grateful.
Right.
Somebody once offered to buy me dinner when I was in Boston. It was a project in Chinatown, and he wanted to take me out to a Chinese restaurant, the developer. And I said, he wanted to take me and the project manager at the neighborhood development agency.
Wow,
So
that's like
it
what
does
happened.
happen.
Yeah.
And both Teresa and I said,
Good for
go
you.
away.
Good for you. Yeah, it's just like, you see that happening a lot in New York. In restaurants being taken out, like you said, I'm gonna take you out on a business restaurant, but I'm gonna leave this briefcase here. I'm gonna use the bathroom real quick. I'll be back, things to that. And it's just like, you see it. It's not just necessarily in large cities, it happens all over. So you just got to use your honor system.
It hasn't happened here in Brattleboro that I know of.
No. And I think even, our consultant community, they're all professional. It doesn't happen here. Anything else? Go ahead,
Yeah,
Frank.
so part of the reason that doesn't happen here is people are confident that they can get a fair, unbiased hearing. And that professionalism is part of what keeps things above board and honest.
It's a good point.
Yep. So is there any other business to come before the board tonight? Anybody have anything?
Well, we already put in our bids for a couple more terms. I already put mine out there for the other committees. So that was another thing, Maya.
Well, I'm up too, so I reapplied. I have one more 3-year term left.
I think I reapplied for my 7, so yeah, very good.
On the application, covered bridge in up on Putney Road, do we have anything scheduled yet for the site visit?
No, they're going to take it in a different direction, and at this point, they don't think they're going to be doing a change of use. And it seems like the project is really still in a fairly early stage of figuring out what they're going to do.
Thank you.
But they've withdrawn the application.
Oh, okay.
So no site visit the beginning of June.
That is correct.
So I can go forward with my surgery then.
Yeah.
And if I had to make it, hey, you guys have wheelchair accessibility, so I mean, I'd definitely be, I'd be slipping in like Clarice from the Mummy, so definitely be ready for that. So yeah, I'm looking forward to see how June does.
So is there a motion to adjourn?
I motion that we adjourn.
Second,
Second,
all in favor, just raise your hand. Aye. Okay, so we'll see you on June 16th. And
Absolutely.
I'm assuming that won't be in person yet, but
I don't think so.
yeah,
Yeah, some of
Okay.
the applicants are counting on a remote meeting.
or counting on a remote.
Yeah, we have some folks from Burlington who will
Oh,
be testifying. So yeah,
Mm.
okay. Okay. So we'll see you on Zoom on the 16th.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. Have a good night. Stay safe.
Yeah.
I
But good night.
Have a good night.